Okay, good morning. So we are doing today Beis Amud Beis, and we are starting from Beis Amud Aleph towards the bottom of the Amud by the two dots. Remember, the Mishnah told us that we had a machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua as to after you do kinoi, you do stira, if that requires two eidim, or if it's sufficient to just use one aid, or al pi atzma. According to Rabbi Elazar, you could rely just on the testimony of one aid or by the guy himself. Whereas according to Rabbi Shua, you need to have two aidim for the stira. You can't just simply have one aid or al pi atzma. Now the more is going to explore that today, and it is definitely helpful to have a chumash if you have one, to be able to hold cup and look into there in Parshas Nosai. So the Gemara tells us as follows: Rabbi Elazar Omer Mekani Al Pishnayim. Rabbi Elazar holds that you do Kinei Al Pishnayim and you do Stira Al Pi Echad Al Pi Atzmai. So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, Ad kan le pligi. Where's the machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua? Ad kan le pligi ela bikini v'stira. Where's the machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua? That machlekes is what? Can you pass me the chumash, please? Where's the machlekes? Where's the machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua? Thank you very much. Where's the machlekes between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua? Only by kini v'stira. Avo b'tumah eid echad mehem. When it comes to tumah, when it comes to actual maisa of intimacy, over there, the Roth of Elazar and Rabbi Shua would agree that even in aid, echad is going to be believed. Says, in other words, and the Taisva Shat, right? We remember that the various different Taisvasin that we have, there's Taisvas Tuk, there's Taisvas Shat, many different Taisvasin, and the compilation of Taisvasin that we have in the Gemara was actually done by a non-Jewish printer, the Daniel Bamberg, in the Shas that he created in Italy, I think it was the 1500s, after the printing press was developed. So he took compilations of Taisvasin and whatever was available, maybe, perhaps, or whatever the scholars, the team that he had assembled thought was best. I'm not sure. Anyhow, Taisvasin uses a lot of Rashi, but sometimes he adds in here and there different questions that we don't see in the regular Taisus, but also different further understandings of Rashi, which Rashi may have been alluding to, but didn't say so clearly. So if you look at the last line here in Taisus Shantz says that why is the Gemara assuming that when it comes to the Tumah aspect, that if it was an act of intimacy, we're going to trust one aid, and both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua agree to that. Where did the Gemara get that from? The Gemara is saying this Machlekes Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Shua, that's not by Kina V'Stir, but by Tumah Eid Echad Mehemen. When it comes to saying that this woman was in an act of intimacy, we're going to trust one aid. Why? Says the Taish look at there at the last line. Tani mashke law mashme the dafka mashke boyishnaim. Al b'tuma be'ed echad sagi di boy b'tuma beis hayle loy manami b'tuma al pishnayim. Says Taish. Look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Hamakana l'isher blazer hamakana al pishnayim umashka pe'ed echad al piatzim. B'shua hamakana al pishnayim umashka al pishnayim." There's a big emphasis on mashka. This is not of a Bavitch, Kiddush, and they refer to the liquor as mashka. That's not what we mean. Says Taishan, the fact that we're focusing on the mashka here, on the drinking, shebai, and on the kinei, and saying specifically over there that that's what the machlekes says, if you need two or is one sufficient, that tells us that the machlekes is only there. But by tumah, if there was an act of intimacy that the witness saw, that would be believed. Even Eid Echad, there would be believed. You hear? That Rashi is not clear on this at all. That's from the Teiz Shantz. The diak from the lashon of the Mishnah being focused or blessed on the word mashka, that it's all, by the drinking Shabbat, but by an act of intimacy, no, even one aid would therefore be sufficient. So in any event, what the Gemara is saying is, I see that Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shua have their machlekes, but only with regards to what is answering up by stira. But by Tuma, even 1/8 is agreed. Says the Gemara, Tanan Nami. We have a Mishnah like this. There's a Mishnah like this. What does the Mishnah tell us? Later on in Lamed Aleph, the Mishnah tells us, Utanan Nami Eid Echad Omer Ani Ra'isi Shenit Meis. If an Eid Echad says, I saw that this woman had engaged in an act of intimacy, she would not have to drink. Again, we're not killing her, right? There's no debate. There's no misa here because that's not the issue here. The question is whether or not she's going to drink from a question of if there's a suffix if she was in fact mizana. And remember, she always has a choice as to whether or not she wants to drink. The question is whether or not you're going to give her the opportunity to drink. And what we're saying is that if there's an Eid Echad that says that there was a misa of intimacy, then we are not going to trust. I'm sorry, we are not going to allow her to drink. And this both Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua would agree to. And this we see later on in the Mishnah. So again, the opening lines of the Gemara are that the Machlokes from Rabbi Shua is only by stira. Both agree that kina requires 2 edim, and both agree that an act of tuma requires only 1 aid. Machlokes is by stira if it's 2 edim or 1 aid sufficient. Good. That's the line of the Gemara entail. Taisus points out, the bottom Taisus on the page. So Taisus points out, what do you mean? Direct Taisus came? I don't understand. Excuse me. I could have said opposite. That what? I would think that made by Tuma, you would require, in fact, 2 edim, because if you're going to now be saying, when you are saying you trust the witness, you are essentially making her not her husband forever. So shouldn't you require a higher bar? Shouldn't you require 2 edim? And it's not from our mission that we're bringing down here in Lamed Aleph. How do I know this? Right? It's not for this little mission that we have here in Lamed Aleph that says that Eid Echad I wouldn't have any idea that this is the case. Is that the only proof? Is that the only source? If I would have thought the opposite. I would have thought Tuma, since you're answering out to her husband forever and ever, that should require a much higher bar, that should require 2 edim. And so says no. It makes sense to say that when it comes to answering her husband on Isser Olam, that if you came to say that there's 2 witnesses to say that the husband was Mekana, if she Isser Olam, no, not Isser at all. You say that there's 2 witnesses that said she was doing stira, that she was closeting herself, closing herself with the person. She Isser Olam, no. She's going to be Isser unless she's willing to drink. But there's a way out. But if you say there's 2 witnesses that say that she was an actual engaged in a mice of intimacy, so that's it. It's over. So why, when you have something that's so significant and so severe, are you going to say, oh no, but everybody agrees that 1 aid is sufficient when it comes to that? Because you found me a line in the Mishnah and later on, that's it. So it says, yeah. You know why that's it? You know why that's enough? There is a benefit that when they come along and test that there's a mice of Tumah here over Kini and Stira, even though we're going to be answering up forever, and you would think that therefore such a high bar you should require 2 edim. No, Mishum Devar Glaim Ladavar. And this is going to be a key on Amud Beis as well. What does it mean by Glaim Ladavar? The general concept in halacha that there's, when there's a line in English, where there's smoke, there's fire, something like that. Yeah, something like that, right? So it's not a situation where it's just coming randomly. There's already Raglayim Ladava. There's already a situation with this woman who already had Kino Yistir. There's already something here. It's not like you're starting ab initio from the beginning and now are going to say, oh, well, 1 aid, we're going to trust 1 aid to tell you something. No, the bar has already been lowered. Well, we've already started the process of the dissolution of this marriage. There's significant issues here. So you already had Kino, you already had Steers, and now you have 1 aid that's coming along. We're going to give it more of a modicum of respect than we would if a 1 aid came along and said, I saw them engaged in my intimacy, and we would ignore them. because there you're just coming to testify, no background. So you want to have one aide come along and be believed with no background to say, oh, this woman was engaged in a of intimacy. We say, go away. You have to have two aides, and we don't listen. But when you already have kinus, you already have things going on. Now you have one aide that says, so then that for Taisus, that's sufficient to understand why you're able to have one aide, Asr up an Isra Olam, in a way that you wouldn't if there was no preceding matters at hand. And this gets even more sharply defined if you look in Rashi. Because Rashi, again and again, on an Aleph and on a Beis, says the following. We look at Rashi. Rashi tells us as follows. Look at the Rashi Aval B'Tumah. So Rashi says Aval B'Tumah, but both Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua, even though they say that when it comes to Kino, you need two eidim. When it comes to Sira, they have machlekes if you need two or one. But when it comes to Tumah, after the Kino and Stira, then even one aid would be sufficient. Says Rashi Aval B'Tumah Im Yesh Eidim B'Kino V'Stira. If there are eidim when it comes to the Kino and the Stira. V'yesh eid echad shekilkala b'stirasa, and there is an eid echad that is saying that she was actually engaged in an act of intimacy in this stira. Naman v'anashosis. So then she would not be given the opportunity to drink. You trust the one aid, and that therefore would mean that there's no, like I said before, it doesn't have anything to do with killing. It has to do with whether or not you're giving the opportunity to prove her innocence by drinking the Sotah. If you had two aids and said she was intimate, or even one, we're saying, then you would not give her that opportunity. She would not be allowed to drink at all. To all three, as we're going to see later on in the Gemara, that we learn out Venitma 3 times, that tells us that she's going to be asur l'bal, asur b'al, and if she's a Eish Kain, asur to eat truma. Look at the next Rashi. Shenitmeis. What did the Mishnah say in Lamed Aleph? There was one aid that said, "Ani ra'isi shenitmeis." I thought she was matama. Be'isa stira. Again, Rashi says, one aid is not just coming along out of the blue and saying, I saw she was engaged in active intimacy. It's ba'isa stira. In that time, when you have this stira going on, you have an aid. And look at Teis Shantz. Again, this could be a grammar thing in the printing press, but if you look at Teis Shantz, the Teis Shantz says, V'yesh aid acher sherosh kikula ba'isa shah. From Rashi, it's not clear that you need a separate aid, but just there was one aid. So you have basically one aid for the tumah, and according to Blazer, one aid for the stira, according to Sure, two aidim for the stira, and one other aid for the tumah. But we're talking about the Isa stira, says Rashi. It's that same stira. In Rashi, you'll see it again and again here, both on Amud Aleph and Amud Beis. The Rashi says that we're talking about the Isa stira. Look at Rashi, the next one. The Gemara is going to say, Minolan de mehem and aid achad. Rashi says, the tumah shall stira, in the tumah of that stira. Right? Again and again, Rashi's harping on this point. So now let's think about Taisus again. Taisus is asking a question. But Taisus, I don't understand. When it comes to answering up somebody to her husband, now he's going to have to get. There's no chance to drink the Sotah. We're saying one aid is believed, and both Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Shua agree. For Taisus, I understand it's a random line in the mission later on in Lamed Aleph. But is that really sufficient? Answers Taisus, no, it's sufficient because there's Raglayim Ladavar. Now let's add in Rashi. It's not merely a situation of Raglam Ladava that there was a kinoi and a stira. It's ba'is a stira. It's at that time that you had either contra b'shua 2 aidim for the stira, or contra b'lezer 1 aid, or alpi atzmai. There was, as the Tosh Shan says, another aid there who didn't just see stira. Right? You have one aid saying they're now closeted together for a kedei tumah, but you have now another aid that says that he sees a mice of intimacy going on. So there, you can understand that's a raglayim ladavar. It's not just one aid randomly coming off in the street. It's not just one aid here. Imagine what Taisus is saying, what Taisus Shantz is saying. It's an aid acher. So you have one aid, or contrary, you have two aidim on the stira, and then you have another aid that's there who's saying, oh, there was actually during that stira, there's a maisa going on. So you have two separate eduyos going on in that moment, saying what was going on during that stira. You have, according to Yeshua, two aidim on the stira and a separate aid, like Shantz is explaining that yes, during that stira, these guys only saw the stira, but I saw an act of intimacy. So it's not just a Raglayim Ladava that there was a Keenan here in the past. It's mamash all happening at the same time. It's not one aid coming from whole cloth. So I think that gives us strength to understand the Tosfos why over here we would lower the bar, and instead of normally what we require to aid them for sure, why over here we would be more open, or Blazer and Yeshua are open to understanding why one aid is sufficient to ask her up in Israel, meaning that she would not be given the opportunity to drink. He has to divorce her without a ksuba. All right, so now the Gemara says, yeah, so the Gemara asks as follows. So it says the Gemara, yes, we have from the proof is from the Mishnah there on Lamed Aleph. I understand. You want to tell both of Blazer and Yeshua agree that one aid is sufficient. In this case, as we pointed out, it says Raglayim Ladavar and as our knech, and adding on to Tosfos with the Rashi, the Isis Dira, and with the Tosfos Shan, it's aid acher. So we have, I think, a good understanding as to why we would lower the bar. But nevertheless, back to Gemara, this is the Raisa level. This is like very significant. How is it that you could ever believe in Eid Achad? I understand there's the Mishnah. You found some line. But still, I need something that's going to be in a pasuk. You want to tell me that you're asking up forever. You want to tell me she's going to be forced to leave without a ksuba. I need to show you a scriptural source. I need to show you something in the Torah. What is it? Says the Ramidaraisa, me know in the man, how do you know that you ever believe in Eid Achad in the Torah? The Tanur Rabbanan, because we have the following. The rabbis taught as follows, and here it's helpful to just either have a chumash to remember the psukim, what it says there in Parshas Nasai. So I'll just read you the psukim, and remember that the Gemara is going to come along and scramble up the psukim because the way the order is written, it's like in Parshas Lachemos, the Gemara in Yuma. If you read the psukim just as it is, it's not going to work. So the Gemara has to unscramble it for us, as we'll see. But for our purposes now, we're just going to have the basic understanding, assuming the Gemara later on, we're going to make that assumption that we already have it unscrambled. All right, so the beginning there, Parshas Sotah, which is in Parshas Nasai, Perek, hey, Pasuk Yud Aleph. So, Dabar b'nei Yisrael, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, tell the Jews, V'amart aleim, you should say to them, Ish ishki sisteh shtoi mola v'mola, right? So a person finds something with his wife, V'shachav ish oisa shechva zera, V'nela me'eni isha v'nistra v'hinitma. So a person is having a relationship with his wife, and they're cloistering themselves. And there was no aid, and she wasn't forced. And he's Mekada's wife, as we'll see later on. This is going to take place before the pasuk before, but for our purposes now, we want to focus here on pasuk Yud Gimel. The pasuk says, the person's having a relationship with a wife. It's like the husband is lost on it. He didn't realize this. And she has been cloisteting herself, closeting herself. And there was no aid. What do you mean there was no aid? And she wasn't forced. Now the Gemara is going to dash on what it means. It says the Gemara, this, that it says that there was no aid. What do you mean there was no aid? What does it mean? Is the Torah talking about two witnesses or talking about one witness? When you say the aid ain't bar, there wasn't the witness. What do we mean? Is it two aidim or one aid? As we turn the page to base, Amud Beis, that when the Torah says that you cannot have one witness testifying about a person, lo yakum aid echad beish. When it says that you're not allowed to have one person testifying about a person, doesn't that teach me lo yakum aid beish? Right? The Torah could have said lo yakum aid beish, that you can't have a person get up and testify about somebody else. And if aid by definition is always requiring two aidim, then I would know that pashit lo yakum aid beish would mean that unless you have two aidim, you can't testify about a person. Wouldn't I know that if the Torah is saying that you can't have an aid get up and testify about a person, that one aid is what we're discussing? In other words, if the standard is two aidim, and I'm saying lo yakum eid be'ish, then I'm saying you can't have one aid testify about a person. And Pasha, we understand that. So why would I feel the need to come along and be like super duper meticulous and say lo yakum eid echad be'ish? You don't trust one. It's Pasha that you don't trust one. Our standard is always two. So if I say lo yakum, if I talk about eidim in the Torah, if I say the word eid, I obviously mean two because it always is two. So if I'm saying lo yakum eid be'ish, I know it means that you need two, and if you just have one, it's not going to work. Why do I have to tell you that aid means one? Why do I have to define? Why do I have to further explain that there was one aid, that you can't trust one aid to get up by and testify about a person? Says the Gemara, "Mashmash nem lo yakum eid be'ish." From the fact that the Torah could have said lo yakum eid be'ish, any adeshu. Wouldn't I know that that's obviously talking about one aid, and you're saying that one aid is not good? Why do I have to tell you lo yakum eid echad bish that you can't trust one eid, that you need to have two? This teaches me kol makom shneimar eid harei kan shnayim ad shifra l'cha hakasav echad. This teaches me that all kol Torah kula, whenever it says the word aid, it always means two eidim. Again, that's a key point to understand in this Gemara. Whenever the Torah uses the word aid, it always means two. Doesn't have to say Adam. Just enough to say one. We're not going to go through this test. Test brings there in the top tesis a whole bunch of examples on this point. We're going to make it as an assumption for our purposes now. And whenever the Torah says aid, it always means two. Now, if aid then always means two, unless the Torah comes along and defines it as one, so then the way I'm going to now bring this back is when the Torah is saying the aid ain't ba. And there was no aid. What do you mean there was no aid? There was no two aidim. When we're saying here in Parshas Sotah, the aid ain't ba, that there was not an aid, we mean that there was no two aidim. What was there instead? One aid. And we're saying there was only one aid, and she wasn't forced. How do you know she wasn't forced? Because the one aid had. Right? If she was in fact forced, if it was a balkarch of her, then it wouldn't be these issues. But we have one aid. We trust the one aid. She wasn't forced, and that's actually becoming usher. And this now becomes the proof to show you, Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua both agree that you are going to be mammon, one aid when it comes to Tumah. Good, does that make sense? So again, it says the Gemara, "Mimash mishnem lo yakum eid be'ish." From the fact that the Torah could have said lo yakum eid be'ish, it didn't have to say eid echad. So any adeshu echad, wouldn't I know that you're obviously talking about one? Matam echad. Why did I have to specify that we're talking about one? Obviously, it always was one. Whenever the Torah says the word aid, it's always referring to two. Unless the Torah comes along and further defines to you that what we're really talking about is one, it would always be two Eidim. So therefore, for Amar Rachmana, Trei Les Be Elacham, the Torah says the Eid Ein Ba, what it means is that there weren't two Eidim, there was only what? One Eid. The Hilan Espasa, and she wasn't forced, the end of the Pasuk. So therefore, since I say I have one Eid, and I trusting the Eid Ein Ba means there weren't two Eidim there was only one Eid. The Hilan Espasa, and the Eid is saying that she had a relationship here of an act of intimacy, and she wasn't forced to do so. And I'm believing her. So therefore, she became asur even with one aid. This is the understanding of Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua and how they get to it. Good? Does that make sense? Now we have to hold cup for the next part of the Gemara, because the Gemara is now going to go a little bit more on this sort of back and forth as to these different psukim. So says the Gemara. So the whole basis of why you're saying lo yakum eid echad be'ish, that we are saying that it refers to one aid, is only because the Torah came along and defined it as one and said the word echad. But if the Torah had not done so, if we didn't say lo yakum eid echad be'ish and instead just said lo yakum eid be'ish, hava amina, I would have understood that that was a reference to two Eidim. And therefore, what do you mean that you always need two Eidim? And over here, then, if Eid is a reference to always two, unless it's defined as one, then what are you saying? So then, Hava Amina Eid, this Sotah Chadhu. Then I would understand it as being one. So in other words, again, what's the reason that we know that the Eid Echad that it says is referring to one aid is only because it was defined as one halav haki. But if not for that, hava amina aid the soita chadhu, then I would understand the aid by soita is one, right? In other words, again, if aidim by definition are two, but when the Torah says aid, it always means two. And how do we know that? That's the bana av that we have from the pasuk in the Varm that lo yakum aid echad beish is needed because otherwise aid always means two. So if I didn't have that, then what would aid mean? Aid would mean one. So if aid means one, then let's go back to our pasuk in Parshas Sotah. When it says v'aid ein ba, I don't have my bana avna for devarim. So now what does it mean when we say aid? It doesn't say aidim. What does aid mean? One. So what does it mean when we say in pasuk v'aid ein ba? There was not one aid there. What was there? What are you then saying? Says the Gemara that the aid by Sotah is only going to now refer to one. And if we're saying v'aid ein ba, we're saying that there's not one aid there. So then says the Gemara, v'afilu chad leka el b'may mitzvah. If there's not even one aid there, then how in the world is she going to become usher at all? Right? The pasuk says v'hilain espasa. She wasn't forced. But if you say v'aid ein ba, means there was no aid, and aid refers to one aid, and you say there's not one aid there, then how do you know that she was forced? What was the evidentiary process? How did you reach that at all? Says the Gemara, so I don't understand. If there's only not even one aid there, then how did she become usher, in fact? Does that make sense? Good? Yes, so the Gemara says, Itzrich. So I'll explain it to you like this. In other words, so before we go to the Itzrich, what's the Gemara's question? The Gemara's question is, I don't understand. If the aid ein ba means that there wasn't even one aid, then how is she becoming usher? How are you saying that the Hila is possible that she wasn't forced? How do you know that? If there wasn't one aid, then how do you know that? By definition, what are you saying? You're saying that there was at least an aid there. There had to be something there. The aid ein ba, the Hila is possible. There had to have been something that would make us believe, make us understand that she would be usher. Elamai. So what are you going to say? That aid is maybe a reference to two aidim, and maybe you only have one here, whatever it is, but there had to have been some element for us to believe that she is going to be usher. So why are you telling me that I only can know that aid is a reference to two from Layakum Eid Echad Be'ish? From that definition of aid, that teaches me the Bana Av all the time. That I always need to know that if not for Layakum Eid Echad Be'ish, that aid could mean one. By definition, it had to mean one. By definition, aid would not mean two. Because what would it mean here? Aid ain't ba, that there wasn't even one aid. Then how would you know that she wasn't forced? By definition, you would have to understand, I don't need layakum eid echad be'ish. Says the Gemara, Itzchach, no. Aid ein ba. I would understand, what does it mean, aid ein ba? Ein ne'eman ba. We wouldn't trust this aid. In other words, the aid ein ba here would mean that we don't trust them. What do you mean we don't trust the one aid? We don't trust what the one aid has to say. That as Rashi, if you look at the Rashi in Itzrich, look at the last lines. Rashi says, the aid ein ba. What does it mean in the pasuk? The aid ein ba. This is what the pasuk means. The aid echad ein ne'eman ba. Ela shnayim. What does it mean, the aid ein ba? It means that we're not trusting the aid echad. You need to have two aidim. The Gemara doesn't like this itzrich, but at this stage, before we go any further, so the aid ein ba is now going to come to mean not that there wasn't one aid there, but rather that we don't trust the one aid. So if we don't trust the one aid, if that's what the aid ein ba means, for the Gemara, ein neman ba, that's what you're saying. That aid ein ba means that you don't trust the one aid, and therefore you need two aidim. What do you mean? Ve'elamai boy, what would you have otherwise thought? Adiika trey, that the aid ein ba is teaching me that if you have only one aid, that you don't trust the one aid. Really, that's the chiddush of the pasuk, that you need to have two aidim. Lishtek kra mine, let the Torah just be silent. Meaning, don't say anything at And if you don't say anything at all, what is my bare minimum going to be? My bare minimum is going to be that you need to aid them. How do I know? The asya davar mi mamain, because we have exer shava from mamain. The Rashi says that by the na'efes it says kimatza ba ervas davar, the pasuk there in Parashki Seitzei, and we have by din mamanis it says api shnei edim yakum davar. So we see by when it comes to areas of arayas and areas of mamanis, there's two of similar word, two usages of the same word, davar and davar. So just like by Mamanis, it's very clear, Apish Nei Edim Yakum Davar, you need to have two Edim. By Dinei Mamanis, so by Dinei Rash, you need to have two Edim. So in other words, let's forget Lo Yakum Eid Achad Be'ish for a moment. That's not here. You just have the pasuk of Ve'ed Ein Ba. The Gemara says, I don't understand. You want to say Ve'ed Ein Ba is coming to teach me that you don't trust one witness, then you need to have two witnesses? I have a better suggestion. Don't say there was no witness. Don't say anything. And if you don't say anything, then it's a regular case of arise. And arise have exer shava that arise requires two edim. So if we have a regular exer shava that arise requires two edim, I have it as my baseline. I don't need you to come along and be mafar to me. The eight ema get me all confused. So says the Gemara. Let's just be quiet, and then I could have Gezer Shava of Davar from my mind. And I would know immediately to have Akol Eduya Shabbatera, and I would know that it's like any other Edis in the Torah that always requires two. Says the Gemara, no, Itzrich. I need to explain to you that over here there was a lack of an aid. Here I needed to have this. I need to have this. Why? Says the Gemara. Because there's already been a raglayim ladavar here. There's a whole basis here by the Sotah. So what I want to tell you is that it's not the same bar that it has by mamnas or by other types of arayas. By a Sotah, it's different. There's already a highway that's been traveled. There's already a raglayim ladavar, right? So it says the Itzrich Sakadat the Chamin Sotah shiny the raglayim ladavar sharikin love and isra l'shemen ba eid achad. So maybe we should have one aid to be believed because you already have a whole raglayim ladavar, right? You already have a whole thing. So now I'm telling you, the aid ein ba is coming to teach you what? It's coming to teach you that the what do you call it? The woman is going to be answered up by virtue of the fact that there's already been a kina stira, so therefore, since already raglayim ladavar, so just merely having a lack of an, you do not need two aidim. Let's hemen ba aid echad. You should trust the one aid. It's sufficient. So in other words, I need to come along and teach you this limud, because otherwise I would say that the fact that there's already been a brewing issues would mean that even one aid should be sufficient. Says the more really, mimatas amras the ain neman ba. Would you really think that by simply having one aid and saying that you wouldn't trust the one aid, that visharya and then she would be mutter, that you don't trust the just one aid alone? From the fact that the Torah says that she was forced, isn't that mechlal da asura? Isn't that clear then that you do have a trust in the one aid that says that she wasn't forced, which by definition means that she's asur? Says the Gemara, I would have thought you need to really have two witnesses. Betray nami ki the lenisbasa, and even made by two, I wouldn't necessarily trust unless these Adam could 100% prove that she wasn't forced. Kamash Malan, that no, we're going to say that in fact you don't learn this limit of Eid Namanba. We put that on the side, and instead Eid is going to be what we said before, that it's a Bana Av, that we're saying that you don't have two Eidim, and in fact you would trust the one Eid. So again, and this the unit here in the Gemara is trying to understand the Eid Ein Ba contra Blezner B'Shua means that there was a lack of two Eidim. You have one Eid. One Eid is sufficient to tell us that by Tumma it's going to be Aser. The reason that it's sufficient is because it was, as Tais pointed out already, Raglayim L'Davar. But the Gemara asks, well, why do I need to have this limud? Why couldn't I just say that on the basis of where it says L'Yakum Eid Echad B'ish, that would be sufficient to tell me that whenever it says aid, it's already two. So if whenever it says aid, it's already two, then if that's my sort of base case, then why do I have to have a whole conversation here by Sotah to let me know? On that, the Gemara is saying, because by Sotah, there was a reason that you might have thought that that an Eid Echad would be much more believed. And the reason that an Eid Echad is much more believed is because of the fact that there's a Raglayim L'davar by a Sotah, which makes it different than the sort of regular situation of an Eid Echad coming in and doing nothing. Yeah. So again, the Gemara is not fundamentally challenging the supposition that we have, which comes out again that when it comes to Tumah, one aid is believed, and yeah. So the last thing I'll just mention to you on this two tasks is if you look at Rashi, Rashi says in the Rashi of Istrich. So look at the last lines of Rashi. Rashi says, "V'hed shenitma ba'is astir." Again, as I mentioned already before, ba'is astir shiny v'roy lahamina kan shaharei raglayim l'davar. Again, on this point that I was mentioning in Rashi already from before, it's again ba'is astir, ba'is astira. The case that we're talking about is a situation where you have the regular Edom of the stira, according to Rabbi Shua, or the Eid Echad, according to Rabbi Lezer. It's an Eid Acher on the Tumah, and that's the reason that we are being able to trust it over here. Fine. So now it continues the Gemara. Says the Gemara, just run through a few more lines. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shua, Eimer Mekanel al Pishnayim. Rabbi Shua says that you, in fact, require two Edim in order to give her kinoi. It's not sufficient with one or alone, or the guy himself. So the Gemara asks, my time is Rabbi Shua, Amar Kra Ba. Right, again, the aid ain't Ba, so there was no aid. What do you mean Ba? Ba v'loy bekinoi. Ba v'loy bestira. So we learn out from Ba that says that you do require two Edim. You do require two Edim in general by the kinoi. Ba, you require the two Edim by the stira, but not by the Tumah. Right? So again, the reason for Rabbi Shua is Ba, the Eid ain't Ba. Ba is where? Only by the Maisa Tumah. That's where you don't require the two Edim. But by the Kina and the stira, you do require two Edim. Rabbi Lezer, Aimer Ba, v'loy bekinoi. He's only coming to be Mamayit Kinoi. By Kinoi, he holds that you need two Edim. But by stira, he holds it's sufficient himself or one Eid. The aim of Ba, says the more v'loy bestira. Says the more, maybe Rabbi Lezer also should say, like Rabbi Yeshua, that Ba means excluding both by kinoi and by steer, that you do require two edim by even by stira. Says the more, no, stira iskish latuma. By stira, it's comparable to tuma. Why? The siv and isra v'hinit ma, because the pasuk says that she was closeted and she was mitama. So you see a comparison, you see a juxtaposition of stira and tuma together. So says the Gemara, kinoi nami iskish latuma, but why are you saying that that's only a juxtaposition by stira and tuma? You find it also by kinoi and tuma. What do we see by kinoi and tuma? Says the Gemara, the kinoi nami ishkish tuma. You see by kinoi also that it's juxtaposed with tuma. The siv v'kinei es ishtoi v'hinit ma. You see that the pasuk says that she was makana her, right, and she became tuma. So you see kinoi and tuma is written together also. So says the Gemara, Hamiyah Rachmana Ba, right? So at the end of the day, you're telling me that according to Rabbi Lezer, it makes sense why Ba is only by Tuma and not by Stira. Why? Because Kinoi and Tuma are juxtaposed. And Rabbi Shua is saying, no, Ba is not by, only by Tuma you need one, but by Kinoi and by Stira you need two. Why? Because we're going to be Mamai both. And we see a juxtaposition of kini and stira, both with tuma. So therefore we can darshan out bavel like bikini, bavel like stira. So the Gemara says, why Rabbi Lezer not? So Rabbi Lezer is coming to say as follows. Says the Gemara, what did Rabbi Lezer? How can Rabbi Lezer answer to? Why is it only bavel like bikini, but not bavel like stira? If they're both juxtaposed with each other and the psukim there, right? The pasuk says bikini asishta v'hinit ma or v'nisra v'hinit ma. They're both, you see, kini and stira are both compared to tuma. So if I'm going to have ba, the eight ain't ba to answer up the woman even with one, so let it specifically exclude both kinoi and stira, not just kinoi. Says the Gemara, Amir Achmana Ba, right? The Torah comes along as Mamayit Ba. So, my Rois, why is it that you're assuming that Kina is more than Stira? They're both juxtaposed with Tuma. So, Ba should come along and knock out either both, or none. But like, why one? They're both equally juxtaposed. After the Gemara, Mistavra makes sense. Stira Adifa Shekena Sarta Ketuma. It makes sense to say Stira more than Kina. Why? Because Stira is answering her up just like Tuma asks her up. Kina never asks anybody up, but Stira can ask somebody up. Says, no, really? Adarab, Kina, other Shekain Ikagarim law. No, but Kina gets the whole thing started, the whole process started. If somebody's just misater themselves, if they just closeted themselves up, but there was no Kina ahead of time, it doesn't do anything. So says the Gemara, so then says the Gemara, Ilav Stira, Kina mi'ika. If you don't have Stira, is there any Kina? It's meaningless, right? The kino alone is not going to be enough. Ilav kino and steer ma'ahani. And if you have a lot of steer but no kino ahead of time, doesn't do anything, right? It's not appropriate. It's ichad, whatever, but it's not more than that. Says the Gemara. Okay, no. Nevertheless, I feel haki stira adifa. So again, at this stage, we still have a question for Abelezer. Why is it that if you have bavalei b'kine, bavalei b'sira, that you're choosing bavalei b'kine and not bavalei b'sira? Or don't do both. But why is it that you're choosing one over the other if the Torah is juxtaposing kinui together with tumah and stira together with tumah? So answers the Gemara. Excuse me, I feel hachi stira adifa the eschalta the tumah. No, stira is something more comparable with tumah because that's the beginning of tumah, right? Eschalta the gula, right? Unfortunately, eschalta the tumah over here. So since the fact that that's the beginning of the tumah process, kino is just kino. The guy's a jealous person, whatever. But the stira, that's already the beginning. That's already the beginning of the end. And so therefore, Rabbi Lezer felt it more over here to be mamayet. So we say bovaloi b'kina. Kina requires two, by tumah it doesn't require, and also by stira, since it's the beginning of tumah, it's a little bit already like tumah. So therefore, he also requires one aid is sufficient over there. We have to stop here.